have something dry, and Gretchen is going to introduce our speaker.
In fact, it's going to be pretty wet, right, with the shorter SOTA of April. Hi, I'm Gretchen Schultz. I volunteer with the Emeritus College, as any of you are welcome to do, and many of you do, and schedule speakers. And one of the privileges is getting to welcome everyone, and I have a welcome I'll offer in just a minute, and getting to introduce the speaker. I just heard somebody ask John, who's going to introduce you? And I looked across and I went like this. A daunting task to contemplate. But yes, first, by way of welcome, a little something I know a lot of you will appreciate. I'm making eye contact with people who can probably recite it right along with me. I asked John if he was going to recite the 18 opening lines to the Canterbury Tales in Middle English. Anyone getting a degree in English needs to learn how to do that, and I think most of us continue to make our students memorize the lines. How many of you had to memorize those? Oh my gosh, look at that. Well, you will know, but what I'm going to do is say them. I can't say them quite as well as John can, but say them. It doesn't take very long. And it's perfect for today and this month and this weather, just perfect. So by way of welcome, I offer the opening lines and a little translation along the way. But you can recite aloud if you want. I'm going to do it line by line with in-between translation. Doesn't need much translation, really. So, Juan that April, with his shortest SOTA, I'm just going to go ahead, forget the translation. The draught of March had pierced to the rota, and bathed every vein in switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the floor. When Zephyrus egg, with his sway to breath, in spirit hath in every holt and heft the tender croppers, and the younge sun hath in the ram his halve cours runner, and smalle foolis maken melodia, that slapen all the night with open ear. So pricketh hem natuur in her courages, dan longen folk to gaan on pilgrimages. And Palmerus, for to seken strange strandes, to ferne houwes, hoot and sundry landes, and specially from every shires ende of England to Canterbury they wende, the holy blissful martyr for to seke, that him hath holpen when that they were seke. Yes. Thank you. So a special treat before we get to our Feast of Words today. A couple of hors d'oeuvres besides that one. A wonderful chance to share with you a man and a song this man has written. I've invited David Lineweber, who's a colleague from the Oxford campus, unretired, and unretiring in every way, a master historian and a master musician. English history, he loves his English history and his English literature, and among other things he's written and performed much and recorded is a wonderful ballad about the Canterbury Tales. So I asked him to come and sing his ballad to begin the program today, and then I will take up the task of the pleasure of introducing John. But first, my colleague, David Lineweber.
Thank you. It's very much an honor to be here in this distinguished company, and thank you, Gretchen. This is a song I wrote 4 or 5 years ago, and I think it may have been performed 4 or 5 times, so this might be no mistake. So I was pleased to come out and have a chance to do it, and it's called The Road to Canterbury. Eat and drink and let's be merry. to Canterbury, tell a tale and lighten the load on the good old Pilgrim's Road. 'Twas April when sweet breezes blow, the showers fall and the flowers grow, and hearts are warmed and yearn to go on the Canterbury Road. From Tabard to bed on down, and southward down in London town, on the way to County King, to St. Thomas' Shrine they went, 29 in hostelry, and there I made their company on the Pilgrim's way to see what we might see on the road to Canterbury. From every station, rank and kind, a sundry life by fate combined, off to see what we could find, pass the time of day. A nun, a parson, and a friar, a noble knight and then a squire, a wife of Bath and men for hire, will England in array. And the tales that we did tell made the time pass by so well, that when they were written down, they did gain a great renown, with their earthy wit and rhyme, and their subtlety sublime. They passed beyond their time to history on the road to Canterbury. As we came into the city, you could hear the bells that tolled, and the pilgrims just kept staring at the evening sun of gold. And when you looked up in the sky, you saw those spires reaching high. There's no way you can look down when you're in Canterbury town. Well, I don't know, but I've been told that words do come and words do go. Some words somehow touch the soul, and then they fade away. And some words somehow linger on after all our time has gone. Like the pictures they have drawn, they never really die. And the tales that we did say were such a slice of every day, that they spoke to old and young in the common English tongue. And from Westminster you still can't see the tomb of Sir Geoffrey, in the Poet's Corner there in the Abbey, still on the road to Canterbury, still on the road to Canterbury.
Oh my God. Not the only one of us to be experiencing chills and tears. Wonderful, David. Thank you so much. It is available, by the way. If you just look up David Weinweber online, you'll find he's got several CDs out there. And this is part of a CD where he's got, there's a song about Beowulf. There's other great works of English literature. Anyway, that was wonderful. Thank you. So now the task, the pleasure of introducing John. It helped me to think, as one does when one is thinking about the Canterbury Tales, of life as a pilgrimage, right? And all of us as pilgrims, and I had some fun actually matching some of you up with some of the people in the Canterbury Tales. I figure we're all on this journey together, right? And thanks so much to those who started, the members of the Emeritus College and guests on the journey. We've got John Bugge here today, of course, and Jean Bianchi's come in. And I mean, there was a time when this wasn't even a twinkle in your eyes, was it? But way back, they began to think about this, and look what it's become. It's just wonderful, and we're moving on the road to Canterbury. To introduce, I would say, our lead pilgrim, wouldn't you?
Yes.
The man. I mean, we've got a lot of wonderful men and women moving along with us, but this is our center, I think, our moral center, our emotional center, our intellectual center, this man. And that eased the task, the pleasure of the introduction for me, because I began to think, why reinvent the wheel? Okay, I thought, plagiarize, right? Some of you know that the Tom Lehrer record plagiarized, but no one else's work of plagiarized. He has been wonderfully well described by Geoffrey Chaucer. And I'm just going to pull a few lines from Geoffrey Chaucer. He probably thinks I'm going for the portrait of the clerk, the teacher from Oxford. But no, I'm going for the knicht. That is the knight, pronounced in Middle English when you pronounce the K and the GHT, right? The knicht. The knicht is the pilgrim. Well, he's the central pilgrim, again, central to that group, to the whole ethos of the Canterbury Tales, the same way John is to us. And Chaucer describes him first because he describes, he deserves that honor. Chaucer, pretending to be less able with words than he is, tries very hard to find enough adjectives to describe the knight and ends up using one, worthy, over and over again, as if he couldn't think of any better. But I'm going to use it too. Anyway, this is just a very few lines, and I will translate. A knicht there was, and that a worthy man. That's clear enough, right? That fro the time that he first began to reading out, from the time he first sallied forth, he loved chivalry, truth, and honor, freedom, and courtesy. Full worthy was he in every way. Now, what he proceeds to do is list all of the various wars that the knight has fought in. But you know what? I mean, we in the academic world, we fight our battles too, right? And I know John has fought right along beside us through these many years. So, and he includes, though that he were worthy, he were wise, wise, and of his port as meek as a maid, as meek as a maid in his demeanor. He never yet no villainy said, he never yet said any villainy in all his life, unto no matter what, to anybody. He was a very perfect, genteel knight. And here is ours.
Thank you, Gretchen. My goodness. And thank you, David. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed that. And thank you all for coming. A little background about this talk. In November, the South Atlantic Modern Language Association held its convention in Jacksonville, and I was invited to give a paper on, the session was called Reinventing the Classics. And some of the classics involved were John Milton, Dante, Jane Austen, and Chaucer, right? And this was part of a scheme that's been done each year at the Samla meeting in the Southeast. The next one is in Atlanta in November, to have a session on authors that are sort of out of favor and who are not very well subscribed to by undergraduates these days. That is the thinking there. And so I had mixed emotions about accepting this charge, because my own feeling is that Chaucer is very relevant. But I did present this paper at that time called Reinventing the Canterbury Tales, and with the twist that the subtitle is Hypertext and the General Prologue. That's how modern Chaucer is, right? Anyway, let me launch into it. There are four major English poets before 1700. Chaucer is one of them. Milton, Spenser, and Shakespeare are the other three, and those four are the big four. And nobody has any trouble reading Milton, Shakespeare, or Spenser even. But everybody has trouble with Chaucer, or at least that is the assumption. And that's because he wrote in Middle English, not Modern English. Modern English begins around 1500. Chaucer died in 1400. And han hat april with the shure sota, the druchte march hat perset to the rota, father every vein which the cool. All that's Middle English, and it's not inaccessible, but it's difficult. But if truth be told, actually Shakespeare's English sounds more like an Irishman in a pub. It really does sound like a modern Irish accent too. But anyway, if you're going to do Chaucer on the undergraduate, or certainly on the graduate level, aesthetic justice demands that you do them in the original language. So you might assume that there's even a stronger case for reinventing Chaucer as opposed to those others. But I had more than 4 decades of experience teaching Chaucer, and frankly, that supposed impediment is a paper tiger. It disappears after about 4 weeks. You have to urge them, maybe with a whip in hand, to go ahead and read this stuff aloud. And once they do, they begin to see that it is very, very pretty, and it is actually quite aesthetically pleasing and understandable. And when they do that, they realize that they're encountering a poet of surprisingly modern and even contemporary sensibility. I hesitate to say postmodern sensibility, but certainly modern sensibility. So the point of what I'm saying today is, despite the title, is that Chaucer's Canterbury Tales don't really need to be reinvented. Not only are they not out of date and inaccessible, they are in fact realized for the reader through a medieval aesthetic of reception that is very much akin to hypertext, what we all know and love, right? Okay, hypertext, what is that? The term is already 50 years old, coined in 1965, over 50 years, by Theodore Hone Nelson, the American pioneer of information technology, in a paper delivered at the 20th National Conference for the Association for Computing Machinery. That's 1946 already. That's how old the term is. Every time we use a computer, we are confronted with the word, albeit in a rather abbreviated form. Hypertext, HT, is the HT in HTML, right? Or hypertext markup language, which is the main system for tagging text files to allow them to be linked with each other as web pages. And virtually every web page address is prefaced by HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which in turn enables the retrieval of HTML documents on the World Wide Web. And for a definition of hypertext, we can go to the venerable Oxford English Dictionary of all places. And here's the definition: texts and graphics, usually in machine-readable form, which are interconnected in such a way that a reader of the material, as displayed on a computer terminal or some other place, can discontinue reading one document at certain points in order to consult other related matter. End of quote. And as we all know, this cross-referencing intertextuality is enabled by what we've come to know technically as links, right? Implanted in the main text. I want to use the term hypertext today in a rather less literal, slightly more virtual sense. In Chaucerian hypertext, the linkages obviously take place without the aid of modern information technology. Though, as I hope to demonstrate with these slides, they could have, if Chaucer had a computer and also the World Wide Web available to him. No, the links don't occur in hyperspace, in cyberspace. They occur in psychic space, in the minds of the reader. And I'll put up on the screen some excerpts from the general prologue to show just how such Chaucerian hypertext invites and even demands that readers search through a complicated web or network of meanings that lie beyond the text. And by the way, the term hypertext is hardly new in medieval studies, believe it or not. It has proved to be a useful concept in reference to medieval manuscripts. What you have here is a panel of a text. It's from the book of Hosea, Old Testament, Jewish Bible. And what you see is in the middle panel, you have the text with a big, glorious capital letter, illuminated capital, the word verbum, V-E-R-B-U-M there. And the text itself is the heavier print here, or not print, but manuscript writing. And in between the lines, you have glossing, and on both sides, you have commentary. So this is a hypertext, in effect. Okay, here's another one. The book of Isaiah. This is a little blurry, and I apologize that I couldn't get it better. In the middle, again, is the text, and it's the darker letters. And in between those lines are glosses, explanations in another language, in this case English. And on both sides you have commentary again. Here's another one, a little easier to see close up, but hard for you in the back to see. But the text is right here, and then what you have on the left is commentary, and on the other side as well. Okay, so text, but also hypertext. All the hypertextual additions that you see, and they were done by the scribe as he copied the manuscript sometimes, or a copyist, or an illuminator, the person who did the pictures, and often by a reader with a quill in hand. This is not a modern type. If you were reading as a monk, you'd have a quill in hand, and you would make emendations to the text yourself. Okay. These are all linked to the main text by a simple spatial proximity, right next to each other. And your eye moves back and forth. Now, in his 2012 book, An Introduction to the Glossa Ordinaria, as a medieval hypertext, the Glossa Ordinaria is a version of the Vulgate Bible in Latin. David Solomon makes a persuasive case, I think, that this particular version is indeed a hypertext. He calls it a hypertext of the mind. And I'm continuing to quote him. Instead of using a mouse to navigate text, the medieval reader used his cognitive processes to navigate and link sections of text in front of him, and also text with which he was already familiar, that he had already read. So the takeaway is that the manuscript culture that Chaucer grew up in, and he died in 1400, and printing didn't get to England until 1470, that manuscript culture was already hypertextual in this way. And that may have had something to do with the way he relies on habits of reading, or what you might call associative reading among his audience. I would maintain that medieval readers were just as accustomed to hypertextual reading as we are, for the following reasons. Number one, Chaucer's readership was small. They probably couldn't all fit within this room, but they might very well fit into one of the big Whitehall lecture rooms. Maybe 200 people, maybe 300. That's the size of his, that's odd to think. When everybody in this room has memorized a portion of the general prologue, it's almost impossible to imagine that his audience was a kind of a coterie, in effect. Never more than several hundred persons. But they were members of the aristocracy and the social groups like the very wealthy London merchants, and they're likely to have had a great deal in common, including a shared acquaintance with certain literary works. We can be confident that all these people were bilingual. English, sure. French, certainly, because the aristocracy actually didn't start speaking English until maybe 1400, as a matter of course. Parliament began using English maybe 1360 or so. But French was the language of the aristocracy, had been since 1066. Plus, if they were like me and had experience as an altar boy. You know, he learned some Latin, and then I had been to school and I learned some Latin. So they were probably trilingual, most of his audience. Not many of us can say that, but they were, and they didn't have to work very hard at it. Much of the literature that Chaucer and his circle knew was already written in French. And he probably could have depended on their having been exposed to a range of works in French and English, maybe some in Latin, and certainly a knowledge of the Bible, which came every Sunday out of the mouth of the preacher or the priest from his pulpit. He'd be quoting the Bible always. And it's a base canard to suggest that the medieval people didn't know their Bible. They did, even though they did not have printed copies of it, for the most part. The most popular French text in court circles, that's plural texts, fell into a category known as the querelle, the quarrel of des femmes, of women, the women's quarrel. These were incipient feminist texts. What is the place of women, right? And this is what people at court discussed. Most prominent of these is the Roman de la Rose, the Romance of the Rose, for a 13th century text, probably the best known book of the Middle Ages after the Bible, if you can believe that. So it's all about love. So there were comparatively fewer texts for them to know also. So they would probably all have known these main texts. Okay, beyond the makeup and linguistic capacities of Chaucer's audience, there's a couple other circumstances to consider. In the 14th century, no reader would look for originality in a work. Not even from Chaucer, right? On the contrary, it would be assumed that a writer was trying to be as representative as he could be of previous works, in effect, as traditional as possible. They would expect that the work of an author would bring back the cultural legacy. It would be a kind of, each individual work would be a vehicle by which the reader would be put back in touch with his own cultural legacy. So there would be stories of Troy, stories of King Arthur. All of these were traditional and handed over. And there was no premium whatsoever on originality. Contemporary literary productions were understood to be linked to past monuments of literature. In other words, what you had is already a network of intertextual correspondences in the expectations of readers. Get a sense of how different this hypertextual reading experience was from our own conventional approach. If you pause for a second, Gretchen mentioned the general prologue. I would like to mention Eliot's Wasteland, which some of you know, and if you may have encountered, as I did in college, where it was a required text. It's one of the very first modernist poems. And as soon as you hit that poem, you're at sea, because it's so very difficult. The cosmopolitan range of that poem's hypertextuality. It's always involved with citing other texts. It has myriad links in it to sometimes very obscure works in several languages, Sanskrit included, ancient and modern. It made this college student wonder if he knew anything about poetry at all. And the people who first saw the poem in 1922 must have been similarly confused. A century ago, this was practically, in 1917, Western readers who had regarded it as axiomatic that a text should be sort of autonomous and stand on its own 2 feet were not equipped to appreciate the Wasteland's cornucopian richness of valence. Eliot was forced to, therefore, to do what no poet had ever had to do, write footnotes to his own poem. And it was notorious at the time. And the footnotes are indeed explicit hypertextual links to what Eliot had been reading and which readers needed to know about but didn't understand, and these were supplied after the fact, after the poem had already been published. Now, however, with the steady advance in technology throughout the 20th century, we've all become the kind of readers who expect our reading experience to be, in the word of one critic, centrifugal, moving out and away to a surrounding cultural matrix of text. Now, let's go to the general prologue, and I'll try to demonstrate how this works. I think this is how medieval readers were invited to read as well. So I've prepared a mock-up of the well-known portrait of Chaucer's prioress. It's a lovely portrait in the general prologue. It's lines 18 to 62. It is also one of the more complicated and layered of all Chaucer's depictions of the Canterbury Pilgrims. So imagine the screen in front of you as a computer screen. There she is. This is not a text, obviously, but it's in a text. It is the miniature. It's not very big. It's only about this big, actually, in reality, blown up here. It's in the Ellesmere manuscript of the Canterbury Tales, which is in the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, a suburb of Los Angeles. And the next time you go to LA, you should go see it. It's the most beautiful Chaucer manuscript that exists. And of course, it's in the United States. As we move on to the text itself, you'll see that what I've tried to do is to follow certain web page conventions by marking the links in the text with underlining the way they are now, and also for ease of viewing in blue, so you can see them. But here we go. There was also a nonna, a prioressa, that of her smiling was full simple and coy. Her greatest oath was but be Saint Eloy, and she was claped Madama Eglantina. That's a fancy name for a nun, Eglantine. Okay. So if I click on that, that's a link, right? I'll click on that. There, right there, that's the link. Click on it, and I get a picture of the flower. Now, you would know that already, right? You wouldn't need this, but the name is Old French, ultimately from Latin. It refers to a plant that combines a sweet-smelling bloom with a thorny and prickly branch. A sweet briar, right? So her name is Sweetbriar. Now, why is that appropriate? Well, do you know the tale that the prioress eventually tells? This is early yet. Of course, we haven't heard her tell. When she is asked to tell the tale, she sort of rears up in her saddle and tells a story, one of the most foul and disgusting anti-Semitic tales ever put on paper. It's incredible how brutally evil it is. Now, this nun, to all appearances, is a pious woman, and in every way it seems admirable, and yet somehow there's something of a disparity between the way she acts and the tales she tells. John Livingston Lowes, an older critic of Chaucer, also noted that the name Eglantine is the name very often of medieval romance heroines. So and these were sex objects, those ladies, right? So the hypertext in this case is actually to a whole set of texts, medieval romances, in which a woman named Eglantine was this very sought-after object of a male lover. So they're erotic texts, and this is a nun. Okay. Therefore inappropriate, right? So I should read again from 122. Full well she sung the Service Divina. That is the Book of Hours. Nuns and monks did this 7 times a day. And tune it in her nose full singly. I was schooled by Franciscan nuns from 1st to 8th grade. And they did this too. They sang through their noses, and I'm not sure why. And when I finally read Chaucer, I realized, oh, it must be something about nuns. But I was told that if you have to sing all day, it's easier to sing up here than down here. You don't wear out your vocal cords. Anyway, it's an interesting detail. And French she spoke, full fair and fete. See there, I was just, she speaks French too, and she's just a local girl. She's from suburban London. After the school of Stratford at Boa, which is sort of like after the school of Snellville or something like that. But French, Paris was here on Knoll. She never been abroad. At mate, well, eat out what she with Allah. She let no morsel from her lips fall, nor wet her fingers in her sauce deep. Well could she carry a morsel and well keep that no drop fell upon her breast. Very fastidious in her table manners, right? There were no forks yet, right, in 1400. That's a later, early modern invention. So you'd be dipping food in the sauce and carrying it to your mouth. This is standard procedure. However, the courtesy books of the time said, don't put your fingers in the sauce beyond the second knuckle. Okay, now here's the link, right? These lines from 128 to 31. And they link to this. Jean de Meun, the second author, the continuator of the Roman de la Rose in French. And you see the French on the left and the English translation on the right. And I'm not going to try to, my middle French is not so good. I could probably try. Eh bien, ce gars qu'elle ne muelle ses doigts en boise jusqu'à au joint. And that translates those first two lines on the right-hand side. She should not wet her fingers in the sauce beyond the joint or soil her lips with soup. And then the three last lines in blue continue the link, and they have to do with making sure that things don't fall all onto her chest when she brings it to her mouth. Okay. Now, it's important to realize who's talking in the Roman de la Rose. In this French work, the woman who's talking is called Old Woman, right? That's her name. La Vieille is her name in French. And she is instructing a character called Fair Welcome, Belle Accueil in French, on how a woman must act if she wants to catch a man, and the sort of conduct that she should also avoid if she wants to catch a man. And one thing she should not do is make a mess of herself at dinner. And don't be a slob, you know? So these 5 lines in blue on the left pretty much match and are the link that Chaucer is talking about. And the text goes on to say in English translation that if the woman is not careful about her table manners, far too rude or gluttonous men might consider her. Now, this is a nun who's doing all of this, right? So continuing with the portrait of the prioress, line 133, hier over lippe weeped she so kleine, that in her cup there was no farthing seen of grease. Once she drunken had her draught. You've probably done this yourself, right? Making sure that you don't leave a big gob of goo on a wine glass. Maybe not. I certainly have tried. I have trouble with that myself, right? Now this detail is also a link, and I'll go to the link. The same poem. Further on, the lines in blue on the left, si doit c'est bien sa bouche terre, qu'elle n'y laisse nulle graisse adhère. She drinks her wipes her mouth so clean that on her lips no speck of grease adheres. Right? So this is what Chaucer is using. But the source is illuminating because it's all about sex in the original. And this is a nun, right? Okay. Now, here's another link. And it's not one that was immediately understood or perhaps so easily understood. There are 3 lines in Matthew. Book 23, verses 25 and 26 that all also have to do with the cleanliness of the dish that you're eating from or drinking from. And I'll read them. 25, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, this is Jesus talking, because you clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but within, they are full of robbery and uncleanness. Thou blind Pharisee, clean first the inside of the cup and of the dish, and the outside too may be clean. Now, Jesus is taking on people who are hypocrites, right? And so this is very strong. This was discovered or suggested by a critic at UCal Berkeley, that Chaucer also had this in mind in regard to the prioress, who, if that's the case, she comes off very much as a kind of hypocrite, or a mindless hypocrite, somebody who doesn't really know how bad she is. And same critic deals with these two lines. A smaller hund is had a she, in line 146. This is the prioress again. She had two small dogs. There's been some dispute about whether nuns should have any dogs at all. They're certainly along on the pilgrimage, you know. It's like the woman in the Cadillac with her Pekingese in the front seat. A smaller hund is had a she that she fed with roasted flesh. In other words, no raw meat, but had to be cooked. And milk, or wastel bread, the most expensive kind of bread. So this is a bit of an indictment, perhaps. She's wealthy, and she somewhat would be. She is probably, in truth, the daughter of an aristocrat who was put into the nunnery, you know, because she couldn't be married off, and she has aristocratic tastes. But if that's a link, it's the link to Matthew 15, 24, 27. Jesus responds to the Canaanite woman. You remember that story? Canaanite woman has a daughter who's very ill. And she comes up. Now, Canaanites were off limits for Jews, right? At least in Jesus' time. And so Jesus gives her some trouble. And he answered her, he said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, not to you people. But she came and worshipped and saying, Lord, help me. He said in answer, it's not fair to take the children's bread and cast it to the dogs. Dogs. But she said, yes, Lord, for even the dogs eat of the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Yeah. And he relents eventually in the Bible story. But this feeding the dogs from your own table is reminiscent, at least, of what the prioress is doing. And of course, this situation links her to the Pharisees as well. And the other part of that is, of course, in her tale, she attacks, or she mindlessly attacks Jews. And Jesus, of course, here in the parable, or in the scriptural passage, is saying that he only deals with the chosen people. And so the people who are not part of the chosen people don't get any respect. And for the prioress, of course, the Jews are not getting any respect. Okay. One more. Starting from 151. Full samely her wimple, pinch it was, the thing she wears on her head as a nun. Her nose, tratus. Her eyen, grey's glass. Her mouth, full small, and that was soft and red. She's rather good looking for a nun. That seems to be the case. What Chaucer is doing is linking these lines, here, these two, but also the lines that follow, to the typical description of the heroine of a romance, called in Latin, descriptio feminae pulchritudinis. Description of female beauty. And even Shakespeare is playing upon this in his sonnet sequence, you know, my mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. He's sort of plugging in to that tradition of describing the woman from head to toe. Start with her hair, talk about her forehead, it's always beautiful and unblemished. Eyebrows, they do not grow together. Her eyes are beautiful and usually blue or gray blue, which is ideal in England, right? And then the nose is perfect, and then all the rest, all the way down the body, actually, all the way down. And it's all erotic, right? And so that's what's being invoked here. In the translation of the Roman de la Rose, which Chaucer probably did, He did part of it at least, and we think this part is from his translation. You have a maiden, her hair was as yellow of hue as on a bison scoured new, her flesh tender as is a chick, with bent brewers, there you are, smooth and slick, and be measure larger were the opening of her e'en clear, her nose of good proportion, her e'en grey as is a falcon. Take a close look at a falcon. Gray eyes. Little mouth, round and to see. So it's almost exactly that. Okay. So here the maiden is depicted, as I said, top down with an eminently kissable mouth. Now, finally, the last part of the portrait is here, up to line 162, beginning at 158. Of small coral about her arm she bore a pair of babies, a rosary probably, or something like it, gowned all with grana. It's very beautiful. And this is pricey too, I mean, expensive. And thereon hang a brooch of gold, full shena, beautiful. Not shiny, but beautiful, as in schön in German. On which there was first written a krone, an A with a crown on top, and after amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. Now everybody knows a text that contains that, but this is the one they probably would have known most proximately, and that is again the Roman de la Rose. In the second paragraph on the left, Bien fils, amour vain, tout chose, right? Fair son, love conquers all. And there it is at the mention of Virgil as well, where it comes from, in the bucolics. So a further link, a link beyond a link, as it were, in this network of linkages, Virgil's eclogue, as you can see in the last line on the first Latin part, omnia vincit amor, et nos pedamus amore. Love conquers all things, let us too yield to love. So, what he has created here in the portrait of the prioress is a quasi-sexual object who is very pretty and very lovely and who is very much off limits. And she is, at the same time, rather unaware of her privileged position and certainly unaware of the kind of monstrous tale that she tells later on. So, let me offer a couple of thoughts in conclusion. There is a picture of Geoffrey. It's called the Huckley Portrait after Thomas Huckley. This is a text from by Thomas Huckley called The Regiment of Princes, or a book on how to be a king. This is manuscript is about 1415. This is the closest in time to Chaucer's death, which is 1400. And he's probably portrayed in his late 50s. He died at age 60 or so. And that's probably what he looked like. Anyway, there's been not very much time to deal with as much of the general prologue as I would like to have, but I would maintain that the principle that I've tried to demonstrate actually works throughout the Canterbury Tales. Many of the tales contain links, all kinds of links to other texts. The Wife of Bath's prologue is a good example. If you know that work, she tells a tale, but the prologue is immense. And it's really sort of the Wife of Bath running off of the mouth about herself for 700 or 800 lines, and it's all autobiographical. And in that process, she contests Scripture, the Bible, and its attitude towards women and sexuality. And so it is nothing but hypertext, right? That's all that is. And she's in constant conflict with the Bible. And in certain of the tales, there are lines inserted that make you read the tale in connection with another tale. So they group the tales group themselves. The most famous group is called the marriage group, which has marriage as a subject, and there are at least 4, maybe 6 tales that deal with that, and they're linked textually the same way. So what I'm advocating for here is the idea of centrifugal reading, right? That phrase I used before, where the life of the text is also at the circumference of it, just beyond to other texts out there. A kind of reading that is always sort of dialectical. This text, but that text too. This text, but think of that sicket non, back and forth. So this is a kind of a thought experiment. Chaucer as webmaster. It's kind of an elaborate metaphor for what you do when you read a medieval author who himself inhabited a sort of hypertext manuscript culture. And if undergraduates can see this, there may be no need to reinvent Chaucer. Just sort of point out that what they're doing with the Chaucer text is exactly what they do when they're online and clicking between various texts as they're led from link to link. They open up a link and they're somewhere else, and then they come back. And that's very much how Chaucer works himself. So medieval and what you might even call postmodern ways of reading, which we do now, are not that distinct. And there are lots of ways in which the Middle Ages and medieval people were on our wavelength more than they were with people who came in the 18th century, for example. So some further thoughts and inferences. This is another portrait of Chaucer. There are about a dozen of them. And only that first one was probably done from life, and we're not absolutely sure about this. This is called the Harvard portrait because it's at Harvard. And it looks a bit like the one before. I like his eyes. They are sort of worldly wise. There's somebody who's seen it all. But I don't know if you can see it from your distance what he's holding in his right hand and what that is there. He's got his two fingers wrapped around something. Any idea what that might be? Looks like a pipe, but it's not. It's close. It's called a penner, Penner. And it is a pen case where you put your quill into to keep it wet, so that if you need to write something, you can pull it out of there. This is iconic, symbolic, significant. It suggests that what we're dealing with here is a portrait of a guy who is a writer, number one. He's a textualist. He deals in text. He's not some jongleur or minstrel by the side of the road. He is very much a member of the establishment, very much, I would almost want to say professional writer, except of course nobody made money on writing until Alexander Pope in the 18th century, just by selling your writing. We know, for example, that the Troilus and Cressida, which a long romance of dealing with the fall of Troy, which Chaucer wrote, he constantly revised. We have his revisions. We can see him in the operation of creating the poem. We know that he worried that future generations would not understand his English. He was concerned about linguistic change, which he lived to be 60. You've probably seen a lot of it already, as we have. We've lived a certain time, a length of time. He was worried that his text would not survive because people wouldn't be able to read him. Same thing I was talking about at the beginning. And also, finally, he had a little poem to Adam Skraven, scribbler, or a writer. He's actually a scribe, right? He's a professional scribe who worked as a scribe for a living, and he did a lot of Chaucer's text, and this is a poem cursing Adam for making so damn many mistakes and introducing errors into his manuscript. This is 75 years before printing got to England, and a generation before Gutenberg. So you had to depend on the scribe getting it exactly right. And if the scribe didn't know a word, he might well go ahead and fill in some word he knew, and that screws everything up. And that's what Chaucer textual scholars are faced with, right? Anyway, all of this suggests that here's a man with a very strong sense of literature as a craft. I mean, it's not his main occupation. He was a civil servant, basically, a diplomat. He does all kinds of things for the king, and he got emoluments for doing all of that. But in his spare time, with his left hand, he was writing all of this stuff, and it's quite amazing. We attempted, I think, to call him a professional, except for the business about the money. But in every way, he deserves the reputation of being the father of English poetry. So any questions, I'll be glad to answer, or comments.
What a room full of people. And we will do our best to pass this mic around. Just because it picks up better on the webcast that way. You could also try and project, and John can repeat questions as they come to him. I actually, since I have the mic, I'm going to start with a question, if that's okay. And so this is my comment, I guess, and question. Among the portraits that Chaucer paints in the general prologue and the whole work, is, of course, the portrait of Geoffrey Chaucer himself. The voice that speaks the general prologue is supposedly the voice of Geoffrey Chaucer. But there's, I think most of us would agree, there's a big distance between Chaucer the poet and Chaucer the pilgrim, the image of himself that he projects. And one of the places it's most apparent, actually, wonderfully apparent, is in the portrait of the prioress that John talks so much about, because of course John emphasized, any of us reading carefully like that, any of his readers reading carefully, we see her flaws, and boy is she ever flawed. She's also quite wonderful in her way, but Chaucer, the pilgrim who is describing her, thinks she's wonderful, period. Would you say that? I'm just wondering what you think about Chaucer's portrait of himself.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. There are three Chaucers. Chaucer the man,
Yeah.
who was the diplomat and the soldier and war hero. He did all kinds of things. He went to Spain twice, went to Italy twice, on diplomatic missions. There are 493 records of his life in the University of Chicago Press publication called the Chaucer Life Records. Not one of those 493 records records the fact that he was a poet. So he was very much a man about the kingdom in his time, but the official blurb on him was that he was not a poet. But then there is Chaucer the poet, and the Chaucer the poet has eyes like this. He sees everything, but he takes a dim view of things that he sees. And there's Geoffrey, who is a persona, a mask, who is the creation of Geoffrey the poet, who is this kind of a ventriloquist dummy, as it were. Here's Geoffrey the poet is up here, and then here's Geoffrey sitting on his lap, and he's talking through him, in effect. And Geoffrey doesn't see very much. He has very wide eyes. He takes it all in, but he doesn't discern what he's seeing. And so it's a fallible first-person narrator technique invented in the 14th century by this very man, Chaucer, to create some ironic distance between what he understood, Chaucer understood, and what Geoffrey, who's kind of dim, mistakes very often. The prioress is a good example. He loves the prioress. He thinks she's gorgeous, and he would, if he had a chance at her, he'd probably take advantage of her. But he doesn't see all of the nuances that we see. So it's the over-the-shoulder technique. We're looking over Geoffrey's shoulder, and we're seeing more than he does.
And by the way, if you were trying to identify the two worst told tales in the Canterbury Tales, they are the two tales that Chaucer the Pilgrim tells. One's so bad, the other pilgrims fuss at him and he quits. Yeah, bad. Here, we got a question.
You created a hyperlink in my mind when you were talking about the wasteland. I think I read a book some years ago about this year's Nobel laureate by Christopher Ricks, in which he suggests that Bob Dylan quotes the wasteland in various parts of his songs. And Ricks suggests that these quotations and these hypertextual links are probably subconscious or not intentional. And so my question to you is, how much do you think this is Chaucer speaking from his general knowledge of literature and these things popping in, or do you think he's done it intentionally? How much is subconscious? How much of these references to other literature is intentional?
Good question. I would come down on the side of intentionality there, because Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are satire. They have each tale, each portrait has a point to it, and it's an attempt to put in his or her place these pilgrims. And I probably disagree with Gretchen. She thinks the knight is an ideal character. I tend to demur on that.
We'll have to talk. That's interesting.
But the idea that text can be sort of in the mind and floating in the kind of superconscious is interesting too. And it's very possible that people will remember phrases that they've heard somewhere and not realize what the source has been and incorporate them into their own word. Like that.
Continuing with Eliot for a moment, his famous phrase, the objective correlative, which is his way of saying, go to the hypertext, a centrifugal always. Why objective? Why not subjective correlative? I get correlative, but why is objective not subjective?
My understanding of objective correlative for Eliot is the thing that brings the emotion up, that it correlates with the interior emotion. So it's a chapel at Little Gidding, you know. That for him is an objective correlative of something internal, something psychic or emotional. And I think that's how I would read it. Yes?
Just let me pass it on back.
Oh. Sorry.
A brief comment in defense of the 18th century. Not all of them wrote for money. There was Sterne.
Right. That's good.
Sterne was always the exception, who wrote his own footnotes about halfway between Chaucer and Eliot. There are footnotes in Tristram Shandy.
Yes, indeed.
And the other clutter as well.
Absolutely. But before Pope, my understanding is that nobody who's writing poetry, belletristic poetry, could make any money off of it unless he or she was Shakespeare.
But many afterwards did.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And Sterne came afterwards.
Yeah, that's true.
50.
It's not an
He
unbroken
wrote,
line.
as he says, if we're to believe him, and I wouldn't suggest that. I wrote not for money, but for fame.
Well, the whole phenomenon of Grub Street, you know, where in the late 17th century and early 18th century, the people who wrote for Grub Street were just doing it to make money. You know, that's all.
There's one over here. Where am I going? Rest of you thinking about.
You emphasized that people had this ability in 2 or 3 languages. Were there English texts that Chaucer cites also? We don't know much in the way of English texts before Chaucer, most of us anyway.
Well, the reason you don't is there are very few. Now, it's interesting, what happened to English was that it went underground after 1066. Old English was killed off. What emerged much later, around 1250 or so, that's the earliest practically, is what early Middle English. But Chaucer was a cosmopolite. He lived in London, he lived in Europe, you know, and he probably didn't know about any English literature in the provinces. He only knew London, and he was very much a Londoner himself. And so the number of texts he knew is in English was probably very small, oddly enough. And we think of them as moving in a sort of a big pool of English writers. Not so. I mean, there were people who are now famous. One was called the Pearl poet, who wrote The Pearl and Gawain and the Green Knight. But that was in the West Country, 200 miles from London. It might as well be on Mars. You know, completely different dialect.
So I'm confused a little bit about the idea that poets didn't make money, because what about people who wrote chansons? Isn't that poetry? Romans de la Rose.
Well, there's patronage.
They made their living.
There is the thing called patronage is what really kept poets going. And if they didn't have a aristocratic patron, then they're pretty much lost. There's no way that you can sell your verses on the street. There were no publishers. You know, you had to have somebody who was well enough off to allow you the leisure time to compose.
Same with music.
Yes, very much the case with music as well. Indeed.
And I'm going to pass this to Thrivy and whoops. I'm going to pass this to Thrivy in just a minute. But what about performance of this material in the old bardic tradition? I mean, would not people gather and have Chaucer or somebody recite, present in oral fashion?
There's a famous manuscript illumination on a page showing Chaucer in a garden reading the Troilus to a bunch of aristocrats who were milling around, not really paying much attention. But has been thought to be a fiction. We don't think now that Chaucer read his work aloud, even though you wish he had, because it's very eminently performable. It's very dramatic, and it can be made dramatic. But we don't think he did that.
Thrivy?
I thought the poems are primarily connotational. They connote something rather than hypertext.
Connotation?
Because, you know, when you're in the first flower, it connotes to that specific flower.
Right, well, the denotation and connotation, both, I think. The name eglantine actually denotes a certain flower, but the connotations of that flower and the name of the flower are that it is very sexualized because of its association as the name of heroines of the romance, pretty much.
I was just going to take the occasion, the mention of dramatic performance, to urge those of you that might be so inclined to go down to the Shakespeare Tavern sometime this month. All through April, they're doing a production of several of the stories from the Canterbury Tales, all woven together, very hyperlinked. Mary Lynn has seen it. I can quote her. She's a Susie Bass judge. She says it's funny as hell. They do it most years, sometime in the spring, and they do a wonderful job. So check it out on the Atlanta Shakespeare Company website.
It's definitely not old English.
It's definitely not old.
Definitely not contemporary.
Okay, we've got a question over here.
From what you say, you're suggesting that Chaucer was writing in a language which had nobody writing in. That is, he was the first and perhaps the only kind of a lonely thing, like writing in Armenian or something like that. Well, maybe that's bad. There's probably lots of people writing in Armenian, but you want to comment on the fact that he's writing in a language that probably nobody speaks and nobody can read.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think you're absolutely right. English was not what it is today, which is basically a world language. It was a very much like Icelandic or Swedish. You know, it's spoken by a small number of people off on the margins of Europe. French was the language, the lingua franca, and Latin, of course, was spoken by intellectuals. But English was simply not used. And so it was a great act of courage, in a way, to write exclusively in English. But English was coming back, and Chaucer was riding the tide, as it were. But he created, helped to create modern English, certainly modern English poetry.
Do you mean it wasn't used by anyone, or it wasn't written? It wasn't a written language?
Oh, it was spoken. It was always spoken
all the time.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So like
not by aristocrats at first, however.
Right.
The aristocrats were French Normans, French speakers, and they didn't want to talk to the newly acquired English-speaking serfs. You know, they had to eventually, and so that's why the English language has now so much French vocabulary in it, because of the confluence of those two population groups throughout the period up to Chaucer and beyond, but not much beyond.
And Clark?
Yeah. John, is there a website that you recommend that would have the Canterbury Tales hyperlinked in such a way that it refers to all of these allusions, pictures? I can see it must exist, right?
Well, the best website actually on Chaucer is Harvard's. And just Just Google in Harvard Chaucer and you will see it. And they do have some of that as well. It's the most complete, if you're really interested in the poet, that is the place to go. It's massive, it's been under construction for decades, and it's really a wonderful site.
Okay, couple of other, pass it on back.
Carrie,
Would you,
shout it out.
Carrie? And then Carrie, if you'll pass to your left when you're ready.
It's interesting how he, is this on? Can you hear me? That he was, in essence, canonized or placed in the Westminster Abbey in the first poet, in the Poets' Corner, for someone not recognized, you know, at that point. He had to have gathered some popularity somewhere along the way.
Well, yes, absolutely. The reason he's in Poets' Corner, and all the other poets are there now too, is he was the first to be buried in Westminster Abbey. And yeah, I don't think he was buried there because he was a poet. I think he was buried there because he probably died there. He was probably living in the precincts of Westminster Cathedral, part of that monastery.
So they just moved him over.
They just moved him over, put him in the floor. And thereafter, everybody decided, well, I want to be with Chaucer. You know? So that's where Poets' Corner came from. Not for poets originally.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, next to you. No,
Oh,
the woman.
Quick question, yeah, just a quick question is, what would you recommend as just a written source to study Chaucer that would include a lot of this kind of hyperlinks but not on the computer?
How about the Canterbury Tales?
Yeah, the critical
themselves?
work.
And annotations.
Oh.
Yeah, with annotations. And,
I
mean, is there any like one?
There's
source that would be best?
a Norton, a relatively cheap paperback Norton edition of most of the Canterbury Tales that has most of those links in it.
And it has annotations.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
The Norton. Okay, great. Thank you.
Anybody else? Anybody else? Okay. Okay. The wife.
Who's that woman up in
Not
front there?
that.
I just
It's
wanted
gonna
to
be a
tell,
tough question.
The wife of Mason Mill.
it's not a question, actually, I just wanted to tell you that about half an hour after our son was born, John sat down with him in his arms and he quoted the first 18 lines of it.
You've done him a world of good, too.
And Gray has a question.
So, Chaucer was presumably trilingual, but he's writing in a language that is five languages, but he's writing in a language that is sort of an off language. Certainly, most of the people speaking English could not read it, but is there any evidence that it was spoken or performed so that sort of the general public could have had access to the works?
Not in his lifetime. The idea that Chaucer was writing for the general public is nonsense. He was writing for a small group of people who shared his worldview, and they were all pretty upper crust, and they all had a kind of shared ethos about what was right and what was wrong, and who was up and who was down, and that sort of thing. And he makes fun of everybody, including the knight, I think, even though the knight is an aristocrat. But according to Terry Jones, one of the members of the Monty Python troupe, who also was a Cambridge history BA, wrote a book called Chaucer's Knight. The knight is actually a pay-for-play knight. He's a what's the word? Mercenary. And there were mercenaries.
No.
Yes. Well, that's Terry Jones's take. And it's kind of interesting where he gets that idea. He was visiting a castle in Scotland, and he noticed that there's a curtain wall around the outside of the castle, and inside there's a keep. And the keep is actually more heavily fortified than the curtain wall outside. He said, why is that? Well, the reasoning went is that if the enemy got inside the curtain wall, you could retire to the keep. But very often, the idea too was your own soldiers who were within the curtain wall could turn on you.
Yeah.
And they would, if the people outside offered to pay them more. Because they were fighting for money and not for chivalry.
And I would add something that I don't know as much about as I should, but I know there are people in the room who know more, the most multilingually educated. I'm looking at David Nesbitt. I bet David knows all this too, but many of you probably do know that in the 1300s, a lot of the, well, we now think of as European languages, began to produce texts in the vernacular. I mean, Dante didn't write the Divine Comedy in Latin. He'd written plenty of Latin, but he chose to write in Italian. I think they were all concerned about being understood, you know, and that was much earlier than Chaucer, beginning of the 1300s. Other questions? Maybe we should get the heck out of here before the Shure Sota become thundery and threatening. Wonderful. Thank you all.